Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being back. We're going to start.
Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. So my name's Claire Berry. I'm the Deputy Director General here in DG Connect. I'm very happy to be able to work on a day-to-day basis with colleagues like Pierre and Chiara on this wonderful blockchain initiative. I really want to thank you for being here this afternoon. I know it's a warm afternoon, but this is our brainstorming tank. This is where we do a lot of brainstorming out here in the countryside. You have seen that DG Connect is in the green countryside, so you can look outside and see a bit of green as well to help inspire you. But it's my pleasure just to be here. I'm only going to say a few words because I know that time is short, and I know that you're all raring to go after this morning's presentations as well, because I'm sure that's generated lots of food for thought. I'd like to thank Michelle, Fink, and the other colleagues who made presentations this morning. Thank you very much for that. I know our colleagues were here from DG Just as well. So this is the second workshop, of course. The first one was very much the macro, as the economists say, the big picture, and now we're into the micro. Big time, huh? And the one thing, I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, so I've learned a lot about technology since I came here to DG Connect from the engineers. And the one thing, there are lots of things that lawyers and engineers don't have in common, but there is one thing that they do, which is we love the micro. We love the micro. We love those details. Huh? So hopefully we'll find some common ground there. Colleagues talking to you about GDPR this morning. Obviously, it's timely in the sense that GDPR, we've all seen so much about it in our email boxes. I suspect that maybe there were even some emails that went to Mars now about, can you check on the list? We're still working on the e-privacy regulation, which gives us a lot of the same challenges, in fact, maybe even more challenges in some respect. Huh? So I see people smiling and nodding at that point. Thank you for your sympathy. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Huh? But I think the idea after this morning is now to see on what we can build on those thoughts that were put out there. I was asking the colleagues how was the tone of this morning? And I heard that it ended on an optimistic note, in the sense that the feeling was, of course, there are issues, but what we should try and do is solve those issues and look at how we can see what blockchain can do to promote data sovereignty. I mean, obviously, there are challenges, but how blockchain, I think, if we design it in the right way, can have that as an objective. Our data scientists, our computer scientists are looking at different solutions. I'm sure several of them have been mentioned this morning as well. The self-sovereignty identity, the ring signatures, the zero-knowledge proof, and so on. So there are already some ideas out there. They go in the right direction. They move us towards more control, more traceability, and more protection at the end of the day. There are still some legal challenges along the lines of, is hash personal data? Is a public key personal data? And I'm pleased to say that whilst I won't stay with you this afternoon, I will go upstairs to examine thesis students at the College of Europe, one of whom my thesis students has written about blockchain and GDPR. So we'll be discussing it not just on the ground floor, but also on the 6th floor of this building. So there are some of those questions, which obviously the lawyers, we need to help find some answers to. But let's take that positive momentum from this morning and start from the assumption that blockchain can pursue and deliver this goal of data sovereignty. And what we need to look at now is how to go about it. So first of all, are there ways to comply with the data minimization principles? I guess you heard quite a bit about that from Olivier Michaud, our colleague from DG Just this morning. How far does the right to be forgotten extend? It can't be a completely without limit right either. And most importantly, and I think that's why we're all here in this room today, because what's important is that Europe can establish the right regulatory framework at the right moment. And we need to do it now reasonably swiftly to be the most influential. And we need to do it in a way which will mean that we can produce large-scale operations based on blockchain. So, the Commission is supporting this with money, put a lot of money behind it. Well, a lot, I mean, relatively speaking. and we'll be putting more money behind it. The European Parliament very much recognises that challenge, so they've agreed to sign up. Quite a few of the member states as well have now signed up and said that they will match what funding we put into it. So some of the right conditions to make an impact are there. We're also putting our best minds onto this. So that means all of you who are here this afternoon to try and find the solutions. So thank you again for being here. Please have fruitful discussions. I hope that we can extract the most of your energy now between 2 o'clock on a Friday and 5 o'clock on a Friday before you go off on the weekend. To do that, I will leave you in the very capable hands here of the Observatory and the Forum team. Thank you very much to them for making it all happen. And so I hand over to you now to pick up, to take the optimistic tone in a decentralized but efficient way. So thank you very much for being here. Do have a good afternoon. And of course, I look very much forward to hearing what comes out of the discussions today so that we can take it forward. And I hope to see you in a further workshop. I guess there are more workshops planned, no? So I look forward to seeing you as well on another occasion. So over to you guys, sir. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I think one of the questions that is often asked of us is, why are we doing all this? Is anyone listening? And I think the speech that we just had is an illustration of the fact that the European Commission is very much hands-on, reading everything that comes out of those groups, and even when you are commenting on the Mobilize platform, which is open to every citizen, there are people reading and taking note of the recommendations that are made. So we are very much under the spotlight, and now it's our responsibility to generate useful guidelines. This afternoon is dedicated to a roundtable discussion, even though the room is not, the tables are not round. It's still very much the spirit. So we're going to stop talking. It will be your turn. What do we want to accomplish? We want to come to a consensus around guidelines that we could give to entrepreneurs and developers who want to innovate using blockchain. Right? So essentially what the situation we're in now is that you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs all around Europe who are trying to innovate or planning to innovate. And they are looking at this group as members of the Observatory or participants to this workshop. So they're looking at this group for guidance on what to do, what not to do, what solutions to implement. I think that's exactly what we want to focus on today. We want to start giving practical advice to them. So we'll have a discussion today. It will not be the end of this process, right? So out of this workshop are going to come out a workshop report, a video, a thematic report that you will be able to comment on, subsequent workshops. So we're really at the beginning of a process which again aims at delivering practical advice to entrepreneurs. So where do we stand now? I think from this morning there are a few words, or, a few items that we've reached consensus on already, which is great news. So first of all, we agree that GDPR is here to stay. We might like it or not, it's not going to change anytime soon. And we have to understand it very well, help others to understand it, and then innovate within the framework provided by this regulation. The second thing that I've heard this morning, which is very important, and I think Michel highlighted it a few times, right? This is not about regulating a technology, it's about regulating what people are doing with this technology. So if I'm using blockchain to speculate or to share information on the supply chain between commodity companies, or if I'm using it to tokenize financial assets, those are all use cases that take place within a totally different regulatory construct, and we have to understand those applications and therefore how they are regulated. And I think the third conclusion or the third message that I heard this morning is no person, no problem. What I mean by that is not every blockchain application involves end users. There are many use cases where companies are sharing data. Blockchain is an example of that. Financial services firms are another example of that. And so, saying that there are conflicts between blockchain and GDPR is far from, getting us to the conclusion that blockchain cannot exist. There are many B2B applications, and those things are relatively clear from the issues that we've highlighted this morning. So with that, I think, and with a view of delivering practical guidelines to entrepreneurs, we've structured this afternoon's discussion in 3 parts. First, what are the technical solutions to GDPR? So if I'm deploying a decentralized application, what are the technologies, the principles that I need to keep in mind in order to deliver something that is compliant? Second, governance solutions. So when I think about governance, who's the processor, who's the controller, what are, in some situations, the helpful guidelines that I can get from this group? And 3 is legal solutions. So if I'm an application or if I'm a developer of application, in some cases, I will exist on the blockchain and anyone can call me without signing terms and conditions. In other situations, and probably in most situations actually, users will be signing terms and conditions or terms of service when they access a blockchain application. And so in that case, the question is, what should be part of those legal terms and conditions? Let's talk about the technical solution first. And here I want to spend a few minutes describing a generic framework or a common way that people are designing blockchain applications right now. This to give a solution, it is not a solution. I'm doing this so that we can align on terminology and visualize what is really the problem that we're trying to resolve. So, as ConsenSys, we develop blockchain-based applications. We also talk to a number of entrepreneurs. And generally, what we observe is that most applications have the following architecture. First of all, you have users, applications, and data stores that are exchanging information. Most of this information takes place off-chain. Right? That's something that most people don't realize, which is that even when we are talking about decentralized applications, most of the data exchange and most of the data storage is taking place off-chain, independently from the blockchain. And so this data is exchanged, it's encrypted. In some cases, it is regular encryption. In some cases, people are working on a new technique, or not a new technique, but a more sophisticated technique called homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption is used in situations where there is encrypted data, and I want to run calculation on that data without knowing what is exactly within that data. And so all of that is off-chain. Then usually there are a couple of layers in between the users and the applications and the blockchain on the other hand. Those layers are called the obfuscation layer and the transformation layer. The obfuscation layer is the layer that aims to pseudo-anonymize the data, or i.e. replace the identity of a user by an address, which can be the same address across usage, or which can be a one usage address, right? An address that only signs one transaction and then is not used by anyone in the system. There are a few ways to do obfuscation. Wallets do that, right? There are many wallets on my computer that generate a new address for every transaction that I do. And so those are called client-side services. There are third parties that can do this service for me. So an easy way to obfuscate my identity is to pay someone that I trust to sign transactions on my behalf. This service knows who I am, but is using a general purpose address on the blockchain. This is the case of exchanges, for example, right? When you're using a crypto exchange today, the address which is signing the transaction is the address of the exchange. It is not your personal address. And thirdly, there are more sophisticated techniques, such as ring signatures, which are mechanisms by which a pool of address is signing transactions, and I can't know exactly for sure which of those 50 or 100 or 1,000 addresses is responsible for the action. The second layer is what we call the transformation layer. So the transformation layer aims at hiding what is the true content of the transaction. So while obfuscation is about masking the source of the transaction, transformation is about masking the contents of the transaction. And here again, when we look at how companies are using blockchain, there are various technologies or ways that this is resolved. The first one, the easiest one, is just to use internal record IDs. What we mean by that is, I think there's an example in Belgium where a consortium of companies, a consortium of banks is developing a KYC platform. Each bank has their KYC records on their own database. Each record has a record ID. And the only thing that they're doing on the blockchain is they're posting timestamps of those record IDs on the blockchain, so that if I look at the blockchain, I just see a record ID number, which has no meaning except for the bank that registered that record. A second way that some players are masking the data is by doing what we call salting and hashing. So salting means I take a piece of data and I add a random string of numbers or characters after it. And then hashing means I run that resulting string through a non-reversible signature generation algorithm that results in a piece of data that no one can understand, but it is unique in the sense that no one can, a little bit like a signature, no one can take that data and pretend that it's coming from another piece of original data. And then there are other types of techniques, more advanced and still very much in R&D, such as zero-knowledge proofs. Zero-knowledge proofs are cryptographic proofs, which are posted on the blockchain. In themselves, they don't mean anything. They just mean that an operation that has taken place out of the blockchain has been conducted properly, and its result is correct. And then at the bottom, usually you have a blockchain layer, which is where you have the data. Generally, the accepted advice at this stage is to say no PII should ever be stored on the blockchain, encrypted or not, which leaves the door open still for other types of data, such as institutional data, balances of accounts, as long as they are anonymized, whitelisting of addresses, which addresses have the permission to do this or that. So that's another way of describing what was mentioned earlier as privacy by design. And there's a debate around that, but perhaps hashed attestations can possibly be stored on the blockchain. There's a debate around that, but again, if we look at the technology landscape today, what we can see is that a lot of blockchain companies are storing those attestations on the blockchain. So, with that in mind, there are a few practical questions that entrepreneurs are asking us. First, should we agree? Is it a reasonable assumption to say that any data, however encrypted, can be decrypted, and therefore nothing should be stored on the blockchain if it is derived from personal information? Question two, if we want to obfuscate the origin of transactions, so the addresses, what methods are acceptable from a practical standpoint? Third question, if we want to encrypt the content of transactions, what methods are acceptable from a GDPR standpoint? And last, and that's a question that is open to all of you, are there, besides the case study that we had this morning, are there other examples of projects that you think are interesting in their implementation of GDPR, and would you like to share those with us? So I'm going to hand over to Vitus to facilitate this discussion. And Tom and Ludovic here, their job is to capture what you're saying and to make sure that at the end of this, of today's workshop, we have a clear list of what we all roughly agree on and what are still the open questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will not waste time on my mic because it's now up to you. You are invited to share your views, your experiences, and lead this discussion. And I see Jörn has already the answer to the first question.
Thank you for this presentation. I kind of got bad news. There is no technology that can be used to ensure that data is not pseudonymized and is surely anonymized. Even if you've got the best encryption that never will be broken, the question is who has the keys to the encrypted data? And so we cannot say, well, this technology is good, use it, and this technology is bad, don't use it. This doesn't work. We have to use a different approach. We have to rather design a process how you can make sure that no PII is on the blockchain in the end. And then I've got some small comments. When you talk about sorting hashes, you should rather talk about peppering hashes. Because when you use the salt is the same for all records. And this is not good for anonymizing. You should use pepper, which is different for every instance you use the hash. And another thing, trusting a third party in doing the transaction for you is exactly what is not sufficient. Because, well, if you have a provider, the provider uses their IP address, but they have a record. Who is behind that IP address? So basically, if that person keeps a record of what kind of transactions they did, it's a classical example where we can derive PII from the records. And a fourth one, I'm not totally against putting encrypted data on blockchain, encrypted PII on blockchain, but I think it's in almost every case, it's not necessary. If you put encrypted data on the blockchain, it means you can only read it if you have external data available. Meaning, if you already need external data, meaning the key to read it, you can put the data itself outside the blockchain, and can use a hash on the blockchain to verify or validate that data. So my opinion is that it's just bad practice to put encrypted PII on a blockchain because you don't need it, and you can avoid that risk in most cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jörn.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. So basically, coming back to the last point you just mentioned, any PII data or which can be decrypted should not be on the blockchain. Is that common sense? Because that is basically the answer to the first question.
Thank you. I try to step back and take a broader view, and I'm thinking at what the world will be in the next decades with transformative technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics and everything. And in a world that will be transformed, there are going to be moments where, for instance, I would like to have my PII on the blockchain because the blockchain could be seen as a open pan-European, let's say in this situation, pan-European database where, for instance, I am jobless somewhere in Latvia, let's say, and if I have my, let's say, my name with my address and my skills on the blockchain, some artificial intelligence could find a job for me in Spain or in Portugal. And if I don't have my PII on blockchain, it cannot be found. So from this, in such a situation, I think that there is a huge risk to the future prosperity of Europe if we see this in a very limited, in a very narrow view and say, no, PII should not be on the blockchain. So my fear is that if I put my PII on the blockchain because I want it there might be a data protection officer who wants to protect me and who might find a company that actually gives me a service. What do? I do and pray with the data protection officers, please do not protect me.
Well, this is the other part of. Okay, this is the other side. If it's not a company, but it's me that wants my data to be published, I have the right to publish my data in any kind I want. And if I want it to be published on a blockchain, I can do so. And this is my right as a citizen, as a data subject. And we should respect that right. And concerning the encrypted PII, I don't think it's a GDPR problem. It's just not necessary to do it in most cases. There might be some special cases where it's necessary, but in most cases it's just not. You can do without it, and so you should do without it.
May I just come back to your point? I mean, what you want to have eventually on a blockchain or accessible by a blockchain is your skill set, but maybe not your address. I think taking into account that something which is on the blockchain can never is immutable, that makes quite a difference. Or did I understand you wrong?
No, but it's still, if it's my skill set and they are associated with me, it's PII. So there could be a data protection officer who says, for instance, who goes to find a company that is storing my data on the blockchain.
Hi, my name is Arnaud Ross. I'm from IBM and I'm a member of the Technical Steering Committee of Hyperledger. So first, to respond to this, I mean, in fact, what you need on the blockchain is enough information to prove your skill set. Doesn't mean your skill set need to be on the blockchain itself. And so
let's let each other speak and then respond.
So I want to speak on the question there, the first one. I mean, at least from an IBM point of view, I've talked to, and I'm not a cryptographic expert nor a privacy expert, but I've talked to them and they've told me basically any encryption method we have today can be broken in 10 years. That should be the assumption. And so any kind of notion that if you encrypt it, you're okay for the next many, many years, possibly ever, as we've heard earlier, seems to be, a fallacy from that point of view. I just wanted to also take advantage, since I hold the microphone for a moment. You talked about zero knowledge proof as something about R&D. It's actually being used today. It's not just research. Zero knowledge proof has been in the works for over 20 years, and we actually have production software now that actually takes advantage of this, that allows you to do things like proving that you're over 18 without actually disclosing your actual birth date. And so this is not just science fiction, it's already usable today. And then the last thing is I wanted to point out is when we talk about privacy, it's not necessarily a black and white issue, right? So when we talk about pseudonymity, for instance, there's also the notion of correlation. Often people forget that aspect. So even if I can anonymize one transaction, as it was talked about earlier, if I use salt, for instance, but I use the same over and over, already the fact that somebody can correlate all the transactions coming from the same person is enough itself already some kind of, privacy breach.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, as we are a relatively small group today, there's no problem to keep the mic open, I would like to ask you to stay to one topic, because then we can easier debate that one. And I hope Fabian will just follow that.
Yeah, my name is Flo. Hello. A lawyer from Berlin. Yeah, I just want to come back to you. First, I don't understand why you want to be found on the blockchain, because you don't need the blockchain to be found. So you can use any other DLT or any other cloud service or LinkedIn or social media account to be found. And the other side is the data protection officer don't want to protect you. It's the GDPR that protects you, because you don't have the permission to waive your rights. And this is one of the problems out of the GDPR, that yet you can't waive your rights.
Exact opposite from Jan Gauci, a lawyer in Malta, who said the exact contrary to what you say. Unlike consumer protection rights, GDPR can be waived. This is what I've heard from a lawyer.
So can I jump in on that one? I think the GDPR, it's not necessarily a question of waiver, but it's a question of there are a number of conditions and exceptions that apply, and obviously consent is a legitimate basis for processing. And so there are instances in which consent might get you somewhere that you're not going to get there wholesale by a third party deciding to do something for you. But equally, the performance of a contract, right? So I think there's enough mechanisms for flexibility built in that might account for some of the situations that you're describing, where those two aren't in tension. But just because you're giving consent or you're partaking in a contract doesn't mean that you're waiving your rights. In fact, you're exercising your rights, and those two are not in tension. They're actually congruous. So I think there's a way they can be reconciled.
Sorry to raise this very, very naive and stupid question, but it's about consent, because we have been talking a lot about consent. The very first question is very relevant, but my question would be, what would consent mean in a world where you will have fully connected objects tracing your position and then sending this data back and forth to car producers or to other people? I mean, what's the nature of consent, and how can we study this from a research perspective in the years to come? Is consent the thing that I click on when I'm accessing something and say, I do accept now? And we've seen the number of mails that we've received now in saying, please tell us that you still want to hear from us. Is consent something that's going to evolve? Is consent something that's going still to be necessary when we will have everything connected? That will be practically letting no, probably anonymization space for our personal data. Sorry, it's a philosophical question, not really on the technical session.
So let me jump in just now. So thank you, Chiara, for this point. As always, you are miles ahead of all of us. So yes, what we want to answer today are questions asked by entrepreneurs. A, how should I deal with GDPR technically? B, how should I deal with it in terms of governance? 3, how should I deal with it in terms of legal? And so we'll talk about what forms the consent should take in due time. For now, I propose we look at those questions which are, again, real questions asked by entrepreneurs. To question 1, what I hear is no PII on the blockchain, even encrypted. Does everyone agree, or is there dissent?
We are talking about zero-knowledge proof.
Well, so zero-knowledge proof is a method of transformation. We'll get to that in question 3.
No. Zero-knowledge proof is also a method of encryption. The information is on the blockchain. It's encrypted in a way that you can only extract certain facets of it. But it's a method of encryption, and it might be breakable in the future as well. So sure. I'm sure about that.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree. This is just not the case. That might be a way to do it. That would be the wrong way. There are ways to use zero-knowledge proof with blockchain without putting the encrypted data on the chain.
you don't really encrypt it, but it has the same fallacies as normal encryption, that it might be breakable in the future because it uses the same kind of algorithms.
Yes, I agree with this, which is why you don't want that data on the chain, which is exactly what this point is about.
So can we agree on?
So I will get to your point later, because I think, again, you're talking about what we call data transformation. So to the first question, do we agree? No PII on the blockchain, even encrypted? Yes, or is there? So I think most people agree. If someone disagrees, please raise your hand and state your position. Sir.
In my position, I think there are absolutely huge positive aspects and use cases to be done when the data is on a distributed open database that is not linked in, who is controlled by a company. That is, so I think if we go into no PII on blockchain full stop, then we are forsaking an enormous range of possible future innovations, and we will regret it. That's my position.
Right, so you're absolutely right. So what I meant is, if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to build a blockchain solution, it's probably a bad idea to put my customers' personal data on the blockchain. But if you, as a citizen, want to put it, that's a separate question. Absolutely. Yes, sir?
Sorry, I think, hi, Vitus Santiago from the Commission. I think that here we are making a very wrong assumption. We are thinking that if there is personal data in the blockchain, is the end of the game. I think we are trying to avoid to have personal data in the blockchain, but I think we can also live with the idea that there may be personal data in the blockchain, and then we will need to apply GDPR. I think we are trying to avoid applying GDPR to the blockchain, and probably it's just easy to see how can we apply GDPR and the blockchain together, trying to avoid that, because the definition of personal data in the GDPR is going to cover everything. I don't think you're going to find any possible method that is going to get a use case in the blockchain where some personal data may be involved, but still you don't have personal data in the blockchain. Because the address, somebody will need to be able to identify who is part of the transaction. Somebody will need to be able to get information out of that transaction. Even if I have a zero-proof knowledge or implement zero-proof knowledge thing, somebody will need to go and say, is this person above 18? So somebody will know that I am above 18. So there it is personal data all the time implied. So I think it's better to think not how I can get rid of personal data and then forget about GDPR, but keep playing with blockchain as I want to play, and more say, GDPR is there, so let's try to operate inside. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you had...
Yes, I wanted to first clarify, are we talking about private blockchains, permission blockchains, or public permissionless ones? Because I think in terms of what the businesses are going to implement and use, that makes a huge heck of a difference. Because if it's a public permissionless, and the company, for instance, puts data on there in good faith with the consent of the consumer, but that public blockchain does not foresee that it should be encrypted, the data could be encrypted or removed, then you cannot remove your consent. And I think that is a big issue. I mean, if as a consumer, for instance, or as a user, you put your data, some valuable data, on a public permissionless blockchain that does not have encryption, like, for instance, Bitcoin, where everything is in clear, and then you want to remove that consent, you can't. It's over. And so the data will be there forever and will be duplicated forever. So I guess the recommendation is not just don't put your personal, the data of your customers on your blockchain, but also use a private blockchain if you have a use case for it. I mean, use a private blockchain, because on a public permissionless one, you cannot affect what's going to happen, even though you may be held liable then afterwards.
Yeah, I think...
Sorry.
You made a very good point. And basically, we are talking about public permissionless blockchains in this respect, because there we have the issue that data controllers, data processors is not very clear.
Sorry,
yeah?
No. The scope of this discussion is any type of blockchain. So I think the comment is valid. We're not restricting today's discussion to public blockchains.
Okay, fair enough.
Sorry about that. Yes.
But there you have the question about the responsibility or the liability we discussed earlier in the morning is much clearer when there are private blockchains. So there you have other means or other leverages. So, but I would say for the sake of the argument, there's a huge majority basically saying yes, we need to be careful. We should, or there is a consent that personal or PII data should not be on the blockchain as a recommendation to the majority of use cases. Which brings me to the next point, which we have already touched upon in the discussion, so maybe it's a little bit artificial to have all the different steps, but the obfuscation methods, sorry for this tongue twister, which are acceptable, because that's then what makes it that they are not identifiable anymore. So where are we on that one? Where do we want? Yeah.
I'm sorry. I think I'm going to change the nature of the discussion or revisit what that gentleman said, which is, I think this line of conversation is getting to the territory of regulating the technology, or what do we think the laws are around using the technology, which is pretty close to the same thing. And I think, as a few people have pointed out, it's about how you interact with the data sourcer and what means of kind of transactions do you get this data, and why are you putting it there, and for what purposes, and is that explained correctly? Is there clear, informed consent about that usage? And I'm sorry, I just feel like maybe some of these lines of questions, and I'd like to hear an opposing view, is kind of talking about regulating the technology as opposed to how to use the technology with informed consent from the user or the data source.
Okay, I think point taken, but I think we should. Those questions are the questions asked by entrepreneurs. Right? They're asking if I'm asking my customers to post transactions on the blockchain. Do I need to find a way for them to obfuscate the originating address, and how do I do that? Now, I totally agree with you that there are other questions that we should discuss, and that's a fair point. But doesn't mean that the questions are invalid.
Can I add a perspective there? So I think the client will ask me, one, will I get sued, or two, will I go bankrupt complying? So I think the way that I would answer this is from that perspective. And I think the GDPR is very mindful of, in multiple places, talking about the available technology and the cost of implementation. I don't think we're ever going to have a fully future-proof solution, because I think that the reality is, over time, all data becomes personal data. So we move from metadata, and then as technology advances, it becomes personal data. The same thing happened with IP addresses. Same thing will continue to happen with all of this technology. So I think the only reasonable approach is to take a horizon of whether it's 10 years or 20 years. Are you future-proofing to that extent? Now, if you also go back to the risks-based approach, what are the risks to the individual 10 or 20 years down the line? They're very different from the risks to the individual now, or in a year from now, or 2 years from now. So I think with those two guiding principles, we can't answer this perfectly, but we can answer it to give business a reasonable enough measuring stick to operate.
Right. So in other words, you're saying there are actions from my users which, if they are revealed 10 years from now, it won't matter, or I'm prepared to take the risk that nobody will sue me for that.
Potentially, there's never going to be zero risk, but it's a different risk calculus from now. And I think that that's where privacy and data protection by design default are really important, because if you set up enough barriers to prevent users from putting themselves at risk, you're making it inherently, you're changing the risk calculus on the front end. And I think you're taking reasonable steps. So I think that in that way, the GDPR is actually quite a reasonable compromise between both, between operating as a commercial entity and serving the end user.
Well, we touched the issue about consent, and of course we all know that consent can be withdrawn. And the question is, can a data subject ask somebody to carve their data into stone, what is essentially the thing that's happening on a blockchain? So I would say, of course they can. And the question is, do we have to model it via consent, or is it more a demand, a contract, or does the data subject have to do it himself, herself? But I think we have to distinguish between normal consent, which needs to be revocable, which needs to be, of course, voluntary, etc., and this kind of special consent where the basic human right of self-determination will lead to the possibility that a data subject says, I want this data to be eternal because I want it, not because it's your business interest, but because I want it.
So this goes to risks and disclosures. Consent is interesting. I think consent should be de-emphasized because I think the standard of consent in the GDPR is extremely hard to attain. I actually think all the emails we've been getting around May 25th are not enforceable because nobody's reading them, right? So I think there are other legitimate bases on which to rely upon. However, if you look at the right to erasure, and if the basis for the processing was consent, the right to erasure is implemented based on the scope of that consent. So if you consented to something full well knowing and willing it was there forever and it can never be undone, well, that's the scope of the consent. And so I think that, again, that's a way to reconcile the right to erasure with someone who's now given consent to that mechanism. But it has to be made abundantly clear, right? You need some kind of bold, all caps, pop-up disclaimer, this is what happens to your data if you put it here. But again, it's about transparency and informed consent.
Thanks. I'd like to move on. I know there are quite a few comments, but my next question might allow you to have a chance to speak. So I think, following up on your point, sir, we've covered the three first questions already, and I've heard a bunch of views from you, and those are all relevant. Now, if we move to an even stronger degree of practicality, do you know, can you describe examples of projects which are using the blockchain in a way that you think is smart, is a model for other entrepreneurs? And if that is the case, would you like to share some information about those?
Sorry, I'm going to not answer your question. Sorry for that. I want to come back to the point I was pointing before. What if we arrive to this compromise? All those measures are wonderful security measures and are going to be there to protect the confidentiality of the information that needs to be confidential and protected. But they are not going to avoid the need to implement GDPR because anyway, we are going to be talking about personal data. What do you say about that?
Sorry, I didn't understand. I think no one is saying that we shouldn't implement GDPR. We're saying, are there examples out there in the wild of projects that you think are implementing blockchain in a way that complies with GDPR and is smart and is a model for other entrepreneurs out there? If no one speaks, I'm going to call you up.
So this is Arnaud Leros again. I mean, Elizabeth probably could talk more about it than I can. And for full disclosure, IBM is a member of the Sovereign Foundation and Hyperledger, where Hyperledger Indy is being developed, which is the software used by the Sovereign Foundation. But I believe the Sovereign Network actually does comply with GDPR. And essentially, it does very much what we were talking about in the sense that what is stored on the chain is enough information at a very high level. I'm not going to get into technical, but at a high level, what is stored on the chain is enough information to prove that the information that is held off chain is valid, and that complies with GDPR.
I can add to that if you'd like. So I work for Evernym, which is a for-profit company which created a set of technology that it has given to the Sovereign Foundation, which operates a public permissioned ledger that, exactly as my colleague from IBM said, basically doesn't put what we're defining personal data within the next 10 to 20 years on the ledger. Rather, what it uses the ledger for is data relating to entities, so legal entities, organizations, and things in the case of IoT, and basically uses the layer as a very thin piece of technology to ascertain the validity of certain information, so valid or revoked, and everything else that is personal data about a natural person or individual is pushed off the ledger and is either stored in the individual's digital wallet and is exchanged peer-to-peer via this agency protocol that we can get into in more detail offline. But it's exactly that approach. And there is something to be said there, obviously, for a permissioned approach where you're building in governance mechanisms. So as I mentioned earlier, we have something called a trust framework, which is basically the business, legal, and technical rules for how the network operates and allows a certain degree of flexibility in terms of giving effect to some of the data subject rights that you might not be able to give effect to in a permissionless setting. But the approach we're taking is one of a conservative approach. So we're saying even if something hasn't been explicitly deemed to be personal data and we don't have guidance on it yet, we're saying if it's conceivably personal data in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to treat it as such, and therefore we're not going to put it on the ledger. And then again, using as much as we can by way of zero knowledge and sophisticated technologies to, again, speak mostly to entities and things. What's really interesting about that is you create this even playing field between an entity and a thing where unlike historically, where an individual authenticates themselves to their bank or another institution they're interacting with, we're creating mutual authentication where when you exchange an identity credential or communicate with an entity, they also have to authenticate themselves to the user. So not only does your bank know that it's you, but you know that it's your bank and not someone phishing for your data. So that's kind of the three pieces of the architecture that I discussed earlier. I would, again, never say that any solution is perfect or fully compliant, but I think there's certainly as much Article 25 as we can possibly stomach going on behind the scenes to make sure that it is.
Yes, sorry, just to come back to the question number 2 and 3, is just to add a bit of complexification on the questions, because I think here is the question is how to be compliant with GDPR, but there is another point of view, is the law enforcement authorities' point of view, because all the methods to preserve identity going to secrecy is the problem for identification of persons by law enforcement authorities. And so I think you need to maybe raise this question, but maybe with a bigger picture, including the law enforcement point of view. And maybe, I don't know if it's accurate, but including the another piece of legislation that is the Data Protection Directive. So I think we because you are still at the beginning of the reflection, it would be worth including that point of view too. Thank you.
Any other points? Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to ask what you mean when you say entrepreneurs and businesses are asking you these questions, because the way I understand it, many blockchain projects, be it Siacoin, Golem, I mean, I think of plenty that I follow, are open source. They are developed by a team of developers, and their business model is completely different from traditional companies. Mostly it's usually you retain a certain number of the tokens, like 10%, and the rest you issue to the people, and then the 10% of tokens, you can resell them if your project is successful. And especially if it's open source and you have a sort of a volunteer community that and maintains the code and makes it grow, and then the actual data controllers or people that would be identified under the GDPR as being responsible are the people themselves that install the tool and then start using it, then who are you giving this advice to? The people that install the actual open source, Siacoin wallet or whatever, and start trading in a sort of a shared economy model where there isn't this kind of business model of profits, dividends, growth, and whatnot. I mean, we really have to be clear about who are the entrepreneurs and businesses we're giving advice to. Is it, the open source developers? Is it the people that are going to use public permissionless blockchains, which will probably never be prosecuted if it's just me mining coins with a tiny mining rig in my apartment? I mean, it's like the likelihood of being prosecuted for copyright fraud if you downloaded 2 movies and a few songs. So, I mean, I'd just like to clarify what you mean by businesses and entrepreneurs.
Sure. So by businesses, we mean businesses like Elizabeth's company, like IBM, like the companies of those of you in the room who are involved in blockchain projects. As for open source projects, there was a well-publicized example on the 23rd of May of a major open source project sponsored by a private company in Germany that was cancelled because the company was afraid of being liable for GDPR. So those open source projects, although the code is open, they are often sponsored by individuals who work in real companies and have to deal with those liabilities. Any other projects? Chiara, please.
I'm not the expert of that project, so hopefully Fabrizio is here. No, I can't see him. But I know that there's a European project called Decode that I'm not expert of, so I will not talk about it. I will probably be inviting him or adding him to some of these questions, because actually what they are doing, they are creating new data governance model where exactly, as many of the solutions that we are hearing, you have the control of your own data, and that apparently is built by following Article 27, Article 25 privacy by design. But so we may be considering this for further discussions.
Oh, thanks. All right, moving on. This one is going to be shorter on governance. So on governance, we've talked about data processors, data controllers. Again, I will start the discussion just with with a couple of examples, not by giving the solution, but by helping you visualize what are the practical questions that entrepreneurs are faced with. Generally, when you post transactions on the blockchain, in most cases, you are considering 2 situations. Situation number 1, you're an app developer and you are dealing with users, and as part of your service, you are posting transactions on the blockchain that may include data related to those users or maybe posted on behalf of those users. So that's the first situation where there's clearly a customer, there's an app that you could argue controls the data, and then there are a number of processing services, including the blockchain nodes that are part of the processing of this data. And then there is a second type of situation, which Sir here I know has raised a few times, which is the situation where I, as an individual, post a transaction on the blockchain. I'm using it from my own, I'm doing it from my own computer, but I'm using services such as a wallet, a blockchain node that are intermediaries between me and the blockchain. In scenario 1, the question usually is, well, is scenario 1 any different from any other kind of web service? And can we simply say the app developer is the controller, everyone else is the processor, and that's it? This could be the case, but there are many people who also question whether we should consider the nodes who run the network as controllers as well. In the second situation, the question is, who is the controller? Who is the processor? Is it legitimate to say that the user, the end user, is the controller? So I don't have answers to those questions. I would like to know if some of you have.
Well, in the first scenario, the question is, why is the data on the blockchain? So if you have a central institution, a central enterprise, and they are using the blockchain. And why are they doing it?
Right, absolutely. And so you're right. I should clarify why this question appears at all, right? And so an example of that exists already, for example, would be a decentralized exchange, right? So you have users who have assets, which are either crypto assets or tokenized assets, tokenized forms of physical assets, like gold, collectibles, whatever. Those users are exchanging those assets on the blockchain, and to do that, they have to post transactions.
Okay. And the second question with the first scenario is, sometimes you need the data on the blockchain. If you use smart contracts, for example, and you say, well, I just put hashes on the blockchain, they don't work. The smart contracts cannot access data outside of the blockchain, so they need the data on the blockchain, and you can't just say, well, put it somewhere else, and the smart contracts don't work.
In some cases, you can have the data out of the contract if you push the data in the contract, but it's not very natural, but you can do it. No? Mr. Professor Ethereum.
So
there is some manner to do it.
I think there are two separate questions. The first one, so to Sir's point, a smart contract can only be called by a transaction posted on the blockchain. So even if the data lives outside of the blockchain, when you have an oracle or anything that transmits data to the blockchain, that takes the form of a transaction, which can be encrypted or hashed or whatever, but so at some point there must be data that transits through the blockchain, even though it is not stored on the blockchain. So Sir is right, it is technically true. And then there's a second question, which is, so you're asking why does data need to be there at all? And again, I'm taking the example of situations where, because we are running smart contracts or exchanging assets that have a life on the blockchain, we are anyway posting transactions to manage the flow of assets on the blockchain, and therefore it is necessarily on-chain. And in that case, who is the controller? Who's the processor? What should be the role of the entrepreneurs?
Can I ask a question? Like imagine, I mean, a few months ago, I guess maybe you've read this. An idiot posted within the metadata of a Bitcoin transaction a link to child abuse material. Okay, say that an entrepreneur decides to create a business and he's going to adopt Bitcoin as a payment service. And within that Bitcoin payment service, some of their clients do just that, include some illegal metadata in their transactions. But this is something that the business kind of opted for. So they decided to adopt Bitcoin as a payment service. Who is liable? What happens in that case? Because the transactions, nothing can be deleted, nothing can be obfuscated.
And maybe you have an idea of... Can you share that with us?
I have an idea. I think it goes to ISPs, right? And it goes back to what I said earlier about one party can act as a controller in respect of some data and a processor in respect of other data. We have explicit guidance from the Article 29 Working Party that says where a message containing personal data is transmitted by a means of a telecommunications or electronic mail service, the sole purpose of which is the transmission of such messages, the controller in respect to the personal data contained in the message will be considered the person from whom the message originates rather than the person offering the transmission services. Nevertheless, those offering such services will be considered controllers in respect to the processing of the additional personal data necessary for the operation of the service. This is super helpful to me because what this means is this paradigm comes down to who can access the data. If you are providing a service or creating a technology where you can route the messages, you can route the underlying contents, but you have no access to them, you're in a very different position from somebody who can actually access the content of the data. It doesn't mean that you don't have obligations. You still have obligations and responsibilities under the law, but they're different, and the risk profile is completely different as well. So it means you might be a controller in respect to the metadata or the routing data, and someone earlier mentioned e-privacy is going to become really important in that regard, right? It's going to become a very important layer here. and mitigating against some of the risks because of the nature of the metadata, which becomes the new sort of toxic waste in our digital ecosystem. But I think that for me is a very helpful distinction. So what I would ask the app providers, can you access the data? Do you have the keys? Do you, all of these questions about, that comes back to control and who's determining the purposes and means. And if you are really just the technology layer that's able to route that in some kind of communications protocol, and you can, even if they come to you and they say, for example, a data subject access request, I want my data, I'm sorry, I don't have it. Well, then your reliability is different and your responsibilities are different as well. So I think the difference between scenario 1 and 2 is do you have access to the data?
And so what do you mean by access? So there's an example that a company brought to my attention recently, which is, actually not a company, an individual, right? So I'm an individual and I'm running a blockchain node on my home computer. Now, because I'm running this blockchain node, I'm storing data from users. And so what should I do if one of those users comes to me and say, delete my data or you will be in infraction to GDPR? Is that a situation that some of you have considered?
But are you sure that you can be an individual user on the node, or you are distributed your capacity of mining for a pool?
So being a miner and being a node are two different things. I am a miner if I run the node and I validate transactions. But if I'm just a node, I have a copy of the ledger on my computer. I just don't validate anything.
But you don't do any action on the
transaction. I don't do the action, but I can read it. I have access. I have read access to it.
So we have to uncrypt the data. It was the answer for the first question.
But again, to Sir's point, right? So if someone puts child porn on the ledger that I have a copy of on my computer and I can't do anything to change it, then how do I deal with the situation?
But if you use YIML 20 years ago, because I'm a little bit old, and you want to reward a movie on YIML or BitTorrent, we do nothing when we receive something that we don't ask for, and I think sometimes we have some cases with porno or others. I don't know if it's depend. There is something about criticity of what you are looking for and what transaction you are making with. No?
I'm not commenting. I'm steering up the discussion, but not commenting. I think you've spoken, so you will get your turn, but Sir here has not spoken for a while.
Yeah, I guess in this decision you have to look on two different ways. The child porno thing is okay. It's your decision to run a node, but you have quite obviously no intent to run a node with child porn inside. So from the criminal perspective, you have to you will it, otherwise you are not liable for this. And on the other side, from the civil point of view, it's I try to help myself with a conditio sine qua non, because if you don't run the node, another person will do it. So the transaction will be there, of course, and if you don't, and from the point of time that you know that there's child porn inside, you have to delete it. Quite normal. You have to delete your node, and then you are out of it. But and before there's no liability for me.
So you take down your Bitcoin node.
Yeah.
Now that you know it.
I'm just wondering if one thing won't change things when we'll have to eventually shard or prune all nodes because of the size of the ledgers, and then you won't know exactly what transactions are on your node because you'll have only a certain percentage or a certain part of the full ledger, and maybe the data will be broken down in such a way that even though it is not obfuscated, because the data is divided in such a way that you cannot, track or reconstitute things, then it's almost as if it were obfuscated. Maybe. That's the suggestion.
Coming back to this example, why do you want to have a node? I mean, you don't need a node to transact with Bitcoins. So you can use a wallet. So if that person is downloading the whole Bitcoin blockchain because intends to do something else with that information, then I will say that person is definitely going into being a controller, because there's this thing about the purpose.
So I will answer the first question factually. I don't have comments on the second part of the question. So the first question factually. So the stability and the trustworthiness of a blockchain network are often linked to the number of nodes running it. Right? The more nodes, the harder it is to do. Harder and the more expensive it is to do a 51% attack and to change one version of the truth. No, it's so it is about the number of nodes, and so if you have a big stake in a Bitcoin or other blockchain, one reason why you might want to run a node is just because you have an incentive to protecting the stability of that network. I'm not saying that's right or not right. I'm just explaining in most situations that's the logic behind the behavior of users.
That person is downloading the node with a purpose, to validate the transactions and to validate the blocks. So I would say it could be moving slowly into controllership.
What I can hear from this discussion is the difficulty to determine the exact qualification for nodes. If the node is a controller, it should know what is processing, what kind of data. So if there is illegal data, it should know about it. If the node is only a processor, the controller should have told the processor what kind of data he has to process. So it should be aware of what he or she is processing. So in any event, if there is illegal content and when the person controlling the node is aware about it, the illegal content should be dealt with. But to my point of view, it's not a question about GDPR, it's a question about hosting illegal content, which is another regulation. So what I can hear from the moment, it's really difficult even for option one to determine the exact qualification applicable to the editor of the app and the hosting provider, the nodes, the wallets, etc.
It's an excellent, and also I want to clarify, yes, so it's an excellent point. I also want to shift the discussion away from illegal content, indeed, because we are talking about personal data, and we extended the discussion to other types of content. But the question is really, what do I do if I run a node and that node has personal data from Sir here who wants to prove that his education certificate is valid? Yeah.
Well, there's another incentive why you run a full node, because you don't want to trust anybody. If you rely on others to perform your transactions, you have to trust them. If you want to validate the transactions yourself, you have to run a node. And the nodes are also validating the transaction. It's not only the miners. The miners are selecting them and putting them into new blocks, but also the full nodes are validating the hashes and make sure that there is nothing being altered.
Claire de Floucaron from Govership consulting firm, specialized in governance. In fact, we are now speaking from solutions based on the existing blockchain. However, this morning we saw that there was kind of conflicts between the European regulation, GDPR, and what the blockchain is able to do currently. So my question is, the users of blockchain should ask themselves if they can use a current blockchain solution, an existing one, or if there is a need to create something else, which would be designed to comply regulations such as GDPR. And the other point, apart this second platform, is that now users of blockchains have to take into account not only their own risks, but also the risks of all persons from whom they get the personal data, meaning customers and so on. And these risks can be different from a person to another one, because a mail address, for example, which can seem not to be very important, may be important for somebody who has to hide for personal reason life. So that's complex. What do you think about these 2 points, please?
I think it's not for us to answer, but for the rest of the group.
A new platform for la blockchain or for blockchain or blockchain existing blockchain?
Okay, I think you have raised an open question which probably nobody has yet asked themselves, and will steer some after event thinking, hopefully. Shall we go on?
Not really. I think we will finish this discussion on governance, then take a break, and then go back and talk about legal solutions and consent. So if there are more comments on the governance part, please speak up now. Otherwise, we'll go for a 20-minute break. Yes, please.
But maybe the difficulty is in uncovering the intention behind a person running a node. Because somebody can run a node specifically to start looking through the transactions and analyzing the data. Another one would run a node precisely because they don't trust anyone and they'll never actually look at the data. They're just doing it to make sure that their transactions are safe or that their bitcoins are not stolen or whatever. So, I mean, it's more, I guess, a case by case when there is a court, a judgment or something or a trial. You'll have to determine whether the person running the node was looking through the data for some reason, was running data analytics to de-anonymize people or not. And you'll have to have some kind of investigation to determine that, because otherwise, when you run a node, I mean, it's running in the background. You don't do anything, and usually you don't even have a computer screen. It's just a computer sitting on the side in your house. So, I mean, I think we'll have to set up some kind of investigation procedure to see if the data was actually analyzed, processed, if pieces of the data were used by the person for doing X or Y, selling the data on, or I don't know, analyzing it for advertisement purposes or others. I think because that is really key, the intention behind the node.
I think that's quite an important fact, and I think it ties in also very well with what Elizabeth keeps telling us, that we have to look at this on a factual base, actually. And I think that's some kind of a rule of thumb. I would say we could. I feel some consent there that actually it very much depends on the intention and what actually in actual fact has been done or intended to be done. If there are no more issues, because we have a quite sophisticated discussion here, I would ask Ludovic how far we have already summarized the answers to the topic here.
Yeah, so what I understand...
You wanted to say something? Yeah. Okay. Can you push the...
It doesn't matter what you want to do. It only depends on what you can do, and as long as you can look at it or analyze it or use it for marketing purposes, it can be done, and so you are in a legal situation. So
no, if you don't have the consent,
no.
You're not in a situation.
And the GDPR speaks about purpose, and purpose is intent. So It's not only about the possibilities, but really about the intent. So I think you really raised a good point. Yeah, it's a case by case look at the yeah.
And when you change it. Yeah, but when you change your mind, you have a problem. So today, I think this way.
But as a rule, you can say that nodes participating in a blockchain, they do it for validation purposes, right? So this is like, as a rule, the only purpose they have. And beyond that, there might be some other ones, but you have to look at that when this really an issue arises. So maybe we can really say in a blockchain, we have controllers that set the purpose and that are the app operators, and the nodes, as a rule, just validate. And this is the only purpose. And so they don't really set the purpose for what the data is processed on the blockchain, because this is the app provider that decides why they operate the app and why they use blockchain.
What I'm hearing so far, and I will let you speak then, sir, but I just want to try and recap what I've heard so far. So what I've heard so far is that there is a framework which is very well defined by Working Group 23. 29, sorry. By Working Group 29, our source of truth for everything. And indeed, you've described it. There's an emitter. There's a party who is emitting a message. There are parties who supposedly are transmitting that message without having access to it. So there's a framework. What I'm hearing, secondly, is that framework is not applicable in a completely clean manner to blockchain technology, because, as we've highlighted, there are situations where, as a node, I have read access to data that can be unclear on my computer, but I can't really modify it or erase it without taking down the whole computer. And the third message that I heard is that, so right now, those actors who are carrying data without the intent are probably safe because it wasn't their intent, but at some point they're going to run into issues if someone decides to target them. And it looks like a likely outcome of all of that is that, and to your point on sharding, it's likely that we are going to see the technology evolve towards a situation where those actors who are purely processors seek to have plausible deniability by splitting the data in various ways or encrypting the data in such a way that they can plausibly say, I don't know what's in there. Is that a fair summary of what we've heard so far?
If I just may add some point on that, you talked about intent, but we don't talk about means, because when we are in charge of a node, who does the work? Is that the person or is it the machine? To what extent is it? To what extent the person who is in charge of a node is doing the job? And I think one question we should be asking ourselves is that there is a legal personality of the node, because finally it's the machine who does the work. It's not the person itself.
It's also really interesting to talk about intent, because I don't see intent in the GDPR. I think in the US we call it mens rea, your mental state, your intention in doing something. It becomes relevant to your liability and your analysis. But I actually don't see intent in the GDPR. I think it's in many ways is a strict liability offense, right? So if you violate the GDPR, you violate the GDPR, it doesn't matter why. Now, obviously, it might become a factor in enforcement appetite in terms of limited resources and who to go after, and there are bad actors that are, actually taking no measure. It might also come into play in terms of Article 25 and, data protection by design default. But I don't think that intent is, I don't see it anywhere, right? So I think that's an interesting twist on this, because it actually comes as a surprise to me that many U.S. laws are drafted with notions of intent, but actually the regulation, as I said, is kind of a strict liability in that way. However, I think that you can say there are, design decisions that were made that are not intending to comply at the outset. But that becomes that also assumes that there's someone making those design choices. So it becomes very hard when you have a global distributed network of decentralized nodes that are, who's determining those design decisions, which is why it goes back to, is that just a technology layer that is facilitating something else to happen, but it really doesn't have the control.
Just to comment on this, it's true that intent, I guess, is not the right way to formulate this. But I mean, I guess we'll have to come to a point where if somebody, for instance, decides to open a Bitcoin wallet, either download the open source wallet or open an account on Paper Wallet or anything else, it has to be almost assumed that they give consent for the nodes to do the actual work to make their wallet function, to make sure that if they pay, that the transaction goes through. So I don't know how we're going to be able to manage that, because consent is supposed to be explicit and you have all these kind of different conditions. But I mean, ultimately, it has to be assumed that when you open a Bitcoin wallet, you consent to all the steps that are necessary for the nodes to do the work that they're supposed to do. Otherwise, you cannot receive payments or make payments. It's not about intent then, it's about your actions as a node. Are your actions in compliance with the consent of the person that opened the account for doing payments and receiving payments? Or have you gone beyond that as a node and you're starting to process the data and sell it and analyzing it? And those are the kind of things that we'll have to clarify. And then finally, I'd just like to end with saying, let's not kid ourselves. For the GDPR, we'll have to wait for the first trials, the first case laws, because right now we're speculating. We have no idea actually how it will be interpreted. Maybe the Court of Justice will say, the Commission back to the drawing board. This is not workable or whatever, and we'll have to redefine certain things or modify certain things. That is not unforeseeable. I mean.
Okay, that's a really great point. I just want to add to that, because maybe that's where some of this notion of intent comes from, is that actually because a processor is defined as acting on behalf of a data controller, as soon as they exceed the scope of the instructions of the data controller, they now assume controller liability themselves. So it's not a static determination of who's the controller, who's the processor. It goes very much to that point. And so while it might not be explicit as intent, it's more, exactly that, is acting sort of within the scope that's authorized.
To Sir's point, I think we now need a volunteer to be the first to go to court. So please raise your hand.
A U.S. company will soon do that for you.
Thanks a lot. Yes.
I just wanted to add for this that governance may help, because we may also determine responsibilities in advance, saying that an end user of this blockchain will have the responsibility of controller, because the governance will have been studied in advance.
Thanks. Time for the break. Back at 3:50, right? 3:50. Okay. All right, let's start. Thanks for coming back. I hope you enjoyed the break and you got some opportunities to network and get to know each other, which also is an important goal of this type of workshops. So we're getting to the final part of the roundtable discussion. We're going to talk about legal solutions and consent. And just to stir up the discussion, I received an interesting email the other day from a well-known platform that allows developers to build open source software. And the email said, I understand the removal of this of my email address. So it doesn't say here, but essentially it says, my name and email address are embedded in the code that I put on this platform. The removal of this information would destruct the open source code that I'm building along with others. And so by using this service, I waive my right to my name and email address being written in that code base. And I asked within ConsenSys, like, is that kosher or not? No one really knows. They said, well, they probably know what they are doing, but we don't know. So I found that was interesting and quite topical given Kara's comment about consent, which leads us to our questions today. So 3 questions. So are there situations where the right to erasure can or must be waived? We all know that, for example, for regulatory reasons, it's entirely permissible to prevent people from erasing their data, for example, as part of the KYC process at financial institutions. So question number 1. Question number 2 is more broadly, are there best practices that you have seen or things not to do that you would like to share with the group because you've seen those legal practices used by blockchain projects? And I think third question, more broadly, let's say you are the CEO of a company or you are the general counsel of a company and you want to, and some engineers are coming to you, they are very proud of their new blockchain project. What are the steps and procedures that you can take to ascertain whether they are compliant or not? So those are the questions for this last session. Let's start with the first one, if you don't mind.
Okay. Michel and then... Okay, I just want to say, I think we need to be careful about terminology here. You can't waive your right to erasure. That would imply that you as a data subject would say, okay, I give up my fundamental rights, which just isn't the way this works. But I think what you're probably getting at is, are there situations where the right to be forgotten or the right to erasure don't apply? And that, yes, that is definitely the case. And you do have that in the GDPR itself, right? So Article 617 actually mentions a range of reasons where this is the case, including to comply with a legal obligation, which, as you rightly said, would be the sort of like KYC AML example. And I think in the blockchain context specifically, one question that hasn't yet been addressed, or at least exhaustively addressed, which I think is worth raising here, is to what extent do provisions relating to the prevention of money laundering or fraud actually apply to every single blockchain transaction? So can you make an argument that Article 17 GDPR just doesn't apply to blockchain transactions in general because keeping records of those transactions might be a means necessary to sort of like detect and combat money laundering and fraud? And maybe that's a question I've been asking myself. I don't know, maybe people from the audience have any thoughts on that, but I think that's definitely one of the sort of like interesting points that's worth discussing in this context.
Oh, that would be quite a powerful conclusion of the day, right?
Yeah, I just also want to say it's not possible to waive your rights under GDPR. So I think we should go to the question how you can comply with GDPR. Like now we go back to the technical questions, technical solutions, how we could erase data without like physically erase them from the blockchain, but like turning them, for example, in anonymous data. So maybe this would be like an alternative way of erasure. So I think Michelle raised this question when she was talking about the different rulings of the ACG, of just the Google ruling was about raising the link, or is it really destruction? So, but as we in blockchain environments, it's not possible to like erase, like destruct. So maybe this is the only way we can think, and we should go back to why information or why this right of erasure exists. It exists because there's this principle of data minimization. So any information that like relates to people, like to a natural person, has to be deleted if the purpose is not there anymore. So if we anonymize information, then they're not there. They're not valid under GDPR. So I think we should go deeper in this question, how we could find alternative ways of erasure. I think this is really crucial because, yeah, distraction is not possible.
And by the way, so yes, but even when you're deleting a file on your computer, as many of you know, you're actually not deleting it. You're just making it harder for the computer to retrieve it.
I would like to explain a bit more technically how you could differentiate at least between what it means destruction information or erasure. We always say erasure of data, but maybe it's more interesting to call it information. And not every bit that you store on the computer gives you some information. I would like to give you an example. You could come up with the color system. Let's say someone expresses yes or no, but you don't save yes or no. You just save green or red color. You have encoding, and then you have to know the key. Is green yes or is green no? And in the moment where you don't have this translation table anymore, and you just see the color green, there's a 50% chance that green means yes or green means no. In this moment where you have not the table anymore, the key, this information, green, is not useful anymore. It doesn't contain any information anymore. Every meaning is equally likely. And in this moment you can understand this is now useless anymore. This is properly destructed information. The question then is an organizational one. How you can make sure that this additional information, the key, is not accessible anymore. And I think here you always have to come up with a risk analysis. And especially in distributed systems where for some time many people may have the key, this is complicated. Your example, when you delete something on the computer, is a bit different because most often it's just not shown anymore, but the information is actually fully accessible when you look under the hood.
If I can just modify that a little bit, I think you can still see a lot there, right? You can see mostly green, all green, no green. You know, I think there's a lot of information you could derive and potentially abuse in that kind of system. I think that's the concern that we have. But I think to Michel's point, which is a super important one, one of the first recitals of the GDPR says that it, by no means absolute, and it cannot be, taken in a vacuum out of context, and it doesn't obliterate all other regulations that are out there. And so, to the extent that there are conflicts there with other applicable laws, they need to be resolved, and it's not going to be resolved, wholly in the context of data protection. And I think even with the right to erasure, even where you manage to satisfy the condition that it's based on consent, that's still a conditional implementation there. And if there's another legitimate grounds for processing, it might override the consent. So I think again, to Michel's point, I think there are other reasons why it might be far more watered down than we expect it to be.
Question number 2? Oh, yeah. Question number 2. Moving from theory to practical examples, are there best practices that you've seen or worked on that you would like to share where you think that the way that consent has been asked in the context of a blockchain project is particularly relevant and a model for us?
You allow me to go back a moment and then I come also to this second part. Regarding the erasure, I think that the concept of data and information as two distinct concepts is interesting, because in fact the erasure is for the information. So if we have the record of a transaction, which refers to data which are not stored there, which can be erased elsewhere, they are not in the blockchain. So then what remains is only the fact that there is a record of something happening with data that no longer exist anymore. And if this is done in proper ways so that there is not a possibility of re-identifying it, I don't see the point. So this should be compliant with the GDPR. I think this is what it is, the assumption on which we've been working in our project. And So this is coming back to that point. As to the consent, well,
Greg, if you don't mind sharing in particular on your own project how you've approached this, for example.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
And on the topic of consent, we'd be very interested to know how you are approaching this in the context of your project.
Something I heard this morning, and I was discussing briefly with Michelle afterwards, that she mentioned the fact that there can be an interpretation of automated processing as referring not only to profiling, as normally it has been considered, but in general as just processing, and so touching also upon the usage of smart contracts. Because we've tried to develop the logic of the handling of consent through smart contracts. We have the concept of a blockchain where there are really minimal data. There's a proof of existence, hashed proof of existence of the data which are elsewhere off chain. There is a proof of matching when they're used, and there is a zero knowledge base for the approach. So it is minimized. But this is in the blockchain. For the rest, there is a catalog where all the data in metadata can be searchable, but they are never touched upon because they're accessed even in advanced analytics through systems of secure multi-party computation or homomorphic encryption. So in ways that you never really touch the data, you just have an understanding of what data are there. And for the rest, the data are combined with, when they are registered, either at the moment of registration or later on, they can be combined with a smart contract giving the permission of using them in specific conditions. So this is the architecture we have developed. And if this can be questioned on the principle of having the forbidding any sort of automated processing because this is considered as such, then this becomes a problem. But I think it would be then really fall into something hindering innovation. Smart contracts is a very interesting innovation regarding the way of digitizing law and contracts, and so it's something which we should try and preserve. So I would like to understand this better. Our approach has been that this is considered as something which is not affected, and this is the approach we've been following.
Just one thing, I think we have to refer also to what Elizabeth said, that you can also see very transparently the rationale that it's behind a smart contract. So it's a way to explain what's happening. Okay, but another thing that I think is probably interesting in answering the second question, sorry, I'm not substituting to the moderator, but it's your consent model. Can you...
We move from a more traditional concept of dynamic consent so that the consent could be changed, modified, adapted, intervened upon by the data subject or the institutional acting as data controller at any specific moment. And we'll try to make this approach compatible with a blockchain base and with an automation of the system. So that's why we moved from there to something which realizes the same approach, the same principle, but through smart contracts. This is the logic we've been following. And one important thing, just to make everybody feel safely for the moment, we're working with, for the time being, while we develop all this, we've been working with synthetic data so that we are fully GDPR compliant anyway, whatever is the interpretation we want to come to.
Can you explain what you mean by synthetic data?
Synthetic data are data which are derived statistically from a large amount of data, thousands and thousands of data. So they're data which are entirely realistic. They could belong very reasonably to any person, but there's no real person behind the data which are used in fact, because they are artificial data. Sorry?
Same as derived data?
It is a statistical development with a Bayesian system behind it. It has been used by the MIT. They have a synthetic vault. It has been used by the NHS on cancer, and it has been used by us. That's the 3 cases I know of, but there must be many more. Anyway, it's very interesting because it allows to have data which are so credible and so responding to the users that they are used also for in silico clinical trials. So you can have them as a way for getting real examples of what would be the reaction to things. So that's what we have used, just to be on the safe side, so that we don't need to go through the difficulties of a sort of catch-22 system by which the ethical boards ask for all the details before this has been developed. So we said, okay, we go for all the details, we'll show you them at the end, and meanwhile we'll work with the synthetic data. And what we aim to, which may be a way of finding a proper solution, is to prepare, by the end of the project, a DPIA, so a data protection impact assessment statement, where the whole thing has been analyzed, and from our point of view, with our legal partners, we try to define why this should be compliant in our understanding to the GDPR. Now we are approaching it with many countries involved, so it should be submitted to different national authorities. We think of finding a way for presenting it at least to the European supervisor.
Well, if the KYC argument works, of course, it would be a great thing because it's a catch-all thing. You don't have to argue in detail. What? If you want to get the consent, maybe you shouldn't just look for consent. You should look at the what are you really doing. If you are performing a Bitcoin transaction, for example, you do a contract, and the contract is about doing the Bitcoin transaction, and then the data processing is justified by the contract and not by a specific consent. And then you don't care about withdrawal of consent, whatever, because the justification through the contract will stay. So you should read Article 6. There are lots of reasons why you can still process data when the consent is withdrawn, and you should look at them, and you might find some, and of course you need to explain it, but you shouldn't just rely on consent.
Wanted to jump in the with the consent. I think they're in an exclusive relation. So you either use the consent or you use the legal basis. So if you are consent and it's withdrawn, you can just not go back to a legal basis. Just to clear that.
There is a debate on it. I don't think it's just decided yet.
Yeah, but. That would open like a lot of possibilities for people just jumping back and forth between legitimate interests why they process data. And I think it's not the spirit of GDPR. But maybe, okay, it's a personal opinion, but...
So this would even mean that you should avoid consent overall?
No, I would say you need consent if you don't have a legal basis. Because when you have a legal basis, this is really a stable basis for data processing. And consent can be withdrawn at any time. So that's why you should first look if you have a legal basis and then ponder if you want to collect consent or not.
Yeah, I just wanted to break the discussion down to the fundamental rights, because the interest of the person who is concerned and who wants to delete any information. I guess it's information, not the data. It's the information set in the data. So the fundamental right of this person is the right of information, or the negative side of this. And the other side of the operator of the blockchain infrastructure is got the same position in fundamental rights. So you always have to switch and to try to find the right solution. And in this context, if you declare and inform the customer who's concerned about this rights, I guess his position is going down, and the position of the operator is going up. So.
Yeah, I just had 2 points. One about consent. From my organization's perspective, and we're an NGO, I work a lot on financial inclusion. We've actually completely ignored the consent part in GDPR because we think it's terrible. In the sense that if you look in financial inclusion, if you want, for instance, to access credit, you are in a lower bargaining position than financial institutions, and they can ask for your consent, and you'll just give it because you want a house, you want something, so you're going to say, oh, you want my Facebook data? Here, take it. Take whatever you need. I want the credit. So what we're mostly focused on is purpose limitation, defining what is creditworthiness, what data is strictly necessary, and what we're going to be lobbying for in the foreseeable future is for very specific cases each time to try to delineate and again, to have real legal certainty over what data is strictly necessary to get a health insurance, get a mortgage or a credit, access certain services, and try to restrict them to the to the least amount possible, and see that they're fair, that they don't discriminate, that they don't discriminate in terms of gender, in terms of sex, religion, location, and all these things. So we really move away from the focus on consent to more really to define everything in more precise terms. It'll be gradual because it will take time, but the Commission is already looking into creditworthiness and how we're supposed to do it, and this we'll try to extend to other services. And the other point is about erasure. I'm wondering if we cannot open it up also to data portability, because as I understand it, when you want to port your data, you want to take it out from a service and into another, which means that the first service has to delete it. But in blockchain, it's more data copyability or transferability more than portability, it seems, because if you cannot erase it from the initial blockchain, then you're just copying it onto another. And then, I think Elizabeth raised that point about data portability. I think it's something that we really should discuss, because there's no guarantee that we'll have compatibility between blockchains and how to, if you want to move your smart contracts from one platform to another, or any kind of data from one blockchain to another, how is that right going to be awarded and afforded? Beats me. And especially if you have a lot of data on a blockchain, is it going to be free? Can you freely download, I don't know how many gigabytes of your data that's on a blockchain into another without paying the transaction fees for it? So, there's a lot of questions.
So my head is spinning. So many of you are asking for time. Also, Sir, Miss, then Michel, then Sir, then Miss. So please.
Thank you very much. So again, the context is that I'm a technologist. I love blockchain. I think it has huge potential to unleash enormous amounts of innovation and bring prosperity and generally serve the purpose of mankind, to quote recital 4 of GDPR. So I'm here asking the lawyers to try to find a way to make this technology compatible with the regulation. So I wanted to ask whether let's say, to come back to the situation that was exemplified earlier on by a colleague behind. The idea that someone, a private person, runs a blockchain node in his basement or wherever, in a cloud service provider, doesn't matter, but he's a natural person running a blockchain node for whatever purposes he runs a blockchain node, because blockchain only makes sense if a lot of people secure the network. So my question is, can we fall under Article 2, Paragraph C? Article 2, Paragraph 2, letter C, this regulation does not apply to the processing of personal data by a natural person in the course of a purely personal activity.
Good question. I will continue to move around down the list of people who have asked to speak. Maybe some of them want to answer. So, Miss.
Thank you. I think in order to answer the three questions, the data controller should ask the following question. What kind of data do I process? For what purpose? What is my legal basis? And for how long do I need this data? So sometimes, as someone said, the right to erasure doesn't apply because it falls within the exception of Article 17.3, but it doesn't mean that you can keep the data for the eternity. You have, at some point, to find a way to erase the data or to apply the right to be forgotten. So the person shouldn't be in any way mentioned in the blockchain. For me, it's a technical question, not a legal question. You have to find a way, the technical way, to make this data unavailable, inaccessible, completely inaccessible from the blockchain. And this should be solved by technical means. As for consent, if you need consent, and sometimes you don't need consent, it should be clear and not mentioned in some dozen pages of terms and services. The person should be really well informed of what is consent to, and the consent should be completely active. So consent is really hard. It's really heavy process, and withdrawing consent is also a heavy process. So you should contemplate the other legal basis. So I think when considering right to erasure and consent, it's the other way to think. It's what kind of data do I need? For what purpose do I need this data? And then you will think about right to erasure and consent, but not the other way around.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you can anonymize completely the data.
No, I think you're talking about personal data. So if for whatever reason it is not considered personal data,
it's okay.
then this logic doesn't apply.
The person will be forgotten.
Michel, your turn.
Yeah, just because you mentioned purpose limitation in the beginning, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it might be worth thinking more about what that actually means in a blockchain context, right? What is the limitation of the purpose? Can you make the argument that, well, the purpose of giving your data to the blockchain means, ensuring the continuous existence of the blockchain? Probably not, but maybe, right? So I think those are things that we should maybe focus on in future discussion, what it actually means in this context. And maybe also just on portability. So the GDPR itself and also the guidance that we have from the Article 29 Working Party are actually quite clear on the fact that portability just means that you get a copy of your data that complies with the conditions set out in GDPR, but it doesn't require the data controller to delete the data that you have at the point. So if you want to have your data, you exercise a request for portability. If you want to have it erased, you still have to sort of like invoke your rights under Article 17. There's no obligation for the controller to do that once you ask for a copy.
Thanks, and thank you for being so concise since we don't have a lot of time left. So, Sir, and then Elizabeth, and then Chiara, and then I think we'll need to wrap up.
On the topic of minimally required data, this isn't necessarily connected to blockchain, but if you're talking about for improving like credit score quotes, I'm just going to put it out there that I think it's a hard empirical question to prove that what extra fields or aspects of a person doesn't make that a more efficient or help risk assessment, and therefore there's a lot of interesting machine learning and AI technologies that are using swaths of data, and every field seemingly has a slightly incremental effect, and then so you don't need to answer this now, but I look forward to looking kind of at your guys' legal proceedings and how you make that case and how you guys try to delineate the marginal effective incremental effect. I'm sorry.
Oh, and going back to the questions. So on question 2, I would say a best practice is to stop focusing on the consent and the terms of service and be realistic about who you are in your market position. Because I think the problem is it doesn't matter what you put in your terms of service or your privacy policy if the reality is completely different and either the user has no choice, they can't move to another provider, there's capture, right? All the things that Martin was mentioning about why consent is so ineffective, or they're in a position where they're at a stage of a transaction where they've now, gone through pages 1 through 8 and they're about to finalize the submission and now you've, prompted them with something. As a lawyer, even though we draft these things, I would say de-emphasize them. Because again, I think the spirit of the GDPR is not about crafting clever, or cute terms of service. It's about acknowledging that, you present certain risks to the end user, and they might not be cognizant of those or fully aware of the implications of their choices. And you're never going to meet that standard of consent if you rely upon the legal boilerplate that nobody ever reads. That's my point of view.
Suggestion between the legal solutions and the technical solutions, so concerning the right to erasure. Is there a way today, so how do we enforce this today? We ask for erasure of information, we decide that it's right, we erase this information, and that's all. Is there a way for blockchain, is there a role to play to demonstrate that this information has been erased, it's traceable, and it can stay as a proof to be invoked if that information reappears, it's used or it's misused? Question mark.
Well, again, it depends on the situation. I can think of a project that I've been involved with, which is a KYC platform, where no data is stored on the blockchain, but you are transmitting personal data to financial institutions in order to apply for an account. And if they deny you this account, then you can request that they delete the data, in which case we're asking the operator, so those financial institutions, to digitally sign on the blockchain an attestation certifying that they have deleted the data, which is a form of proof that the data has been deleted, although it's not a proof, it's not a technical proof, it's a proof that you just say, I have deleted the data. So that's one example among many.
To answer to question 2, I think we have to change our culture because companies thought that personal data of their customers were there. Now they are the data of the customers. They have to create a new relationship with the customers or employees or every person concerned by GDPR. For customer, one possible action would be with inbound marketing to bring them content, to add them value, so that they would like to give their consent to receive communication from the company and to become promoters of your brand.
Thanks. So focus on your business, not on the terms of service. That's a profound conclusion. So thanks a lot. We're going to do a quick recap of what we've heard today. Ludovic is going to do that. 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes to explain next steps, and then you'll be on your way.
So today we have been through the 3 main elements, starting with technical solutions, focusing on that. And one of the things that made consensus is the fact that putting PII on the blockchain is not something that is advisable nor necessary. Second thing would be that in practice, it depends a lot on the actual type and the actual use case of the blockchain and the blockchain type. Is there? No? Okay, sorry, I thought that there was a remark. Regarding obfuscation and data transformation methods, we agreed on the fact that today there are existing methods such as ring signatures, zero knowledge proofs, peppered hashes. We didn't go into the details of these solutions, but what we agreed upon during the discussion is that they are more or less robust. None of them are perfect, and they might be considered as long as they are effective for enough time. And going through the unanswered questions on the exact same point, what we can say is that there is a question that is unanswered about the fact that is it justified to use obfuscation or data transformation methods if they are robust enough for a long period of time until the data becomes irrelevant. This question was left unanswered during this discussion. And finally, some examples of successful implementations were cited, were quoted, such as Sovereign, Everim, and Decode. And in the next steps, if you have more elements, please follow up with that and give us more examples of that. Final element that was left unanswered, but that was mentioned during the discussion is peppered hashes. And the discussion did not answer the fact that is peppered hashes personal data or not. This has to be clarified. Regarding governance of governance solutions, there are two main elements that have been identified. First, a party can be a controller for certain data and a processor for other data. And that really depends on what data is currently being processed. And for example, if the data is only routed, the party can be considered as a processor. But there is multiple aspects and not necessarily only one regarding that. And the second point is that there is no unique answer regarding the status of nodes. We have discussed a long time regarding what would be the status of nodes, and what comes out of the discussion is that we should be looking at nodes in a case-by-case manner. For legal solutions, that should be displaying, but I will be just taking my computer.
Maybe the next page, no? Rate of erasure.
I will just do it by oral, and of course you will have all these elements that will be shared with you after the discussion. But very quickly on this, regarding legal solutions, what we said during this discussion and what I understood from that is that you can't waive your right to erasure, but there are some cases where the right to erasure doesn't apply. This is a distinction that was very important and that was made and agreed upon during this discussion. In blockchain, there are possible alternatives to erasure, for instance, making data inaccessible or not displaying it, but this has to be further discussed, and there was no real consensus on that. Regarding the consent, it was fully disclosed that the term of services are not the only thing that matters, and the situation should include the reality of what's really happening and not only the terms of consent hiding behind that. And to go through the questions that are left unanswered, we discussed during today the fact that asking permission each time the data is processed by a smart contract is a possible best practice, but there was no real consensus on that, and this is only a possible solution for today. So, regarding the next steps for today, so these are the different elements we broke down regarding the discussions we had. This will be put into documents. And basically what we have regarding this team is, as you already know, we had a research paper that was shared with you. Today we had this workshop, and out of these workshops, we will have two main elements that will be coming out. First, a workshop report that will summarize the discussions of today and the main elements and consensus. And second, the workshop videos, because today was recorded, but very simply. And out of these elements, a draft of a thematic report will be created, and you are invited to put your hands on it, comment, and suggest and be part of the creation of this thematic report. This will be published on mobilize.io, and all people who are in the working groups and all the people who attended this meeting will be invited to participate and create this document together, this thematic report together. After that, we discussed that within the observatory, and I want to have your opinion on that, but we think that it might be necessary to do a second workshop on this very topic of GDPR, answering the questions that are still unanswered. There was very good debate today, but many questions are still left unanswered. So what we are aiming at right now is maybe doing a second workshop in the coming month. And if you have a specific opinion on that, please share it with us. And finally, out of these discussions and the final workshop, there will be the final thematic report that will be published. And this is basically the timeline we have regarding GDPR. So thank you very much for attending today's meeting. And as you can see, there will be concrete solutions and concrete elements that will be coming out of today.